Welcome to Conspiracy Theories and Cover-Ups. I'm your host, Ben Carter, and in today's episode we unravel a theory that suggests the real power in our world does not lie with governments, presidents, or even royal families, but with two seemingly ordinary financial firms. Their names are BlackRock and Vanguard. According to some, these entities do not just manage money, they manage the world. And what they control might be far more than you think. To understand how BlackRock and Vanguard rose to the level of global influence attributed to them today, we have to look back at the evolution of financial markets over the past few decades. The groundwork for this silent financial empire was laid during the deregulation waves of the 1980s and 1990s, when major governments across the world began lifting restrictions on banks, investment firms, and asset managers. These policy shifts allowed private financial institutions to consolidate power in ways never before seen. In the United States, the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act in the year 1999 opened the floodgates for mergers and acquisitions between commercial banks and investment firms. This legal change blurred the lines between retail banking and corporate investing. At the same time, financial instruments like index funds and exchange-traded funds became wildly popular, allowing everyday investors to put their money into bundles of stocks with relatively low fees. These funds had to be managed by someone, and that someone was often BlackRock or Vanguard. BlackRock was founded in the late 1980s by Larry Fink and a small team of Wall Street veterans. Originally part of the Blackstone Group, it eventually broke off and evolved into a massive asset management firm. What set BlackRock apart was not just its size, but its pioneering use of financial technology. In the early 2000s, the firm developed a risk management software known as Aladdin, short for Asset, Liability, Debt, and Derivative Investment Network. This powerful system allowed BlackRock to analyze trillions of dollars in assets and manage risk with surgical precision. It became so influential that other financial institutions, even competitors, licensed it. By the end of the 2010s, BlackRock was overseeing over $10 trillion in assets. Meanwhile, Vanguard took a different path. Founded by John Bogle in 1975, it was built on the idea of long-term passive investing. Vanguard popularized the concept of index funds, which track the performance of broad market indices. Its low-fee model attracted millions of small investors and pension funds. Over time, Vanguard quietly became one of the largest shareholders in nearly every major publicly traded company in the world. It operated differently from BlackRock. As a client-owned company, it has no outside shareholders. But its influence is equally far-reaching. By the 2020s, these two firms, BlackRock and Vanguard, were no longer just participants in the global economy. According to public financial disclosures, they had become top shareholders in thousands of corporations, including giants in tech, pharmaceuticals, energy, defense, and media. And yet few people outside financial circles could name them. That secrecy, some say, is by design. The names at the helm of these companies rarely make front-page news, but their reach and power are enormous. Larry Fink, the co-founder and longtime chairman of BlackRock, is often described as the most powerful man in finance, yet the average person has never heard of him. Through a combination of political access, regulatory influence, and sheer financial control, Fink has developed deep relationships with central banks, treasury departments, and world leaders. He has served on advisory boards for multiple United States presidents, including both Republican and Democratic administrations. When crises hit, like the global financial collapse in 2008 or the pandemic-driven crash in 2020, governments turned to BlackRock not just for advice, but for action. In 2020, the United States Federal Reserve hired BlackRock to manage emergency bond buying programs designed to stabilize the economy. That meant BlackRock, already the largest asset manager in the world, was now in charge of choosing which companies would receive lifelines and which would not. Critics immediately raised questions about conflicts of interest. After all, BlackRock held stakes in many of the same companies it was tasked with supporting. But there was no oversight committee, no public debate, just a quiet transfer of control under the justification of urgency. At Vanguard, power is more dispersed, yet just as significant. Its founder, John Bogle, intentionally structured the firm to avoid outside ownership. This model allowed Vanguard to focus on long-term investing rather than quarterly profits, which drew in trillions of dollars from retirement funds, pensions, and individual investors. But behind the cooperative language and low-cost mission lies a powerful centralization of voting rights. Vanguard holds massive voting shares in nearly every major corporation, including competitors. This gives the firm indirect control over corporate policies, board elections, and executive pay across a broad swath of the global economy. Together, BlackRock and Vanguard are often the top two shareholders in companies that many believe to be rivals: Apple and Microsoft, Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson, Google and Facebook, Coca-Cola and Pepsi, even defense contractors like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. On paper, these companies are competing, but if their largest shareholders are the same two entities, the question becomes, are the conflicts real or just theatre? These firms also hold dominant positions in media. Through ownership stakes in companies like Comcast, Disney, and Time Warner, they influence the very narratives the public consumes. And because these investment firms are not household names, their presence remains largely invisible. For those who believe in the conspiracy, this is not an accident. It is the perfect disguise for absolute power. The most compelling claims made by those who question BlackRock and Vanguard's influence come from a careful analysis of ownership data. Public filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as data from platforms like Morningstar and Yahoo Finance, reveal a repeating pattern. BlackRock and Vanguard consistently appear as the top institutional shareholders in thousands of publicly traded companies. These companies span every sector imaginable, from defense and biotech to consumer goods and media, creating a dense web of cross-ownership that many argue cannot be accidental. Take the pharmaceutical industry, for example. In the year 2021, BlackRock and Vanguard were both top shareholders in Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, and AstraZeneca. These are the same companies responsible for manufacturing and distributing vaccines during the global pandemic. While the public saw competing pharmaceutical brands, the largest beneficiaries of their record-breaking profits were the same two firms. The same pattern emerges in big tech. Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft, five of the most powerful technology companies on Earth, all list BlackRock and Vanguard as leading shareholders. Even in the fossil fuel sector, firms like ExxonMobil and Chevron list the same dominant investors. This cross-ownership gives these firms the power to vote on corporate decisions. Through proxy voting, they can influence everything from mergers and acquisitions to environmental and labor policies. Critics argue that this is the real danger. It is not that BlackRock or Vanguard sit in every boardroom. It is that they do not need to. Their votes speak for them, and their interests are aligned with maintaining the status quo of global capitalism. Another critical piece of evidence cited by believers is how deeply embedded BlackRock is within global financial systems. Its Aladdin platform, the massive risk analysis software created in the early 2000s, is now used to manage over $20 trillion in assets worldwide. This software powers decision-making in banks, insurance companies, pension funds, and central banks across the globe. Its algorithms influence not just what to buy or sell, but how risk itself is defined in the modern economy. To some, this is akin to allowing one private entity to define the weather forecast for the entire financial system, and then make trades based on that forecast. Vanguard's influence, while less technological, is rooted in passive investing. Critics argue that because it mirrors the entire market, it can never truly challenge corporate behavior. If every company's success becomes Vanguard's success, then it has no incentive to rock the boat. This passive approach might appear harmless, but when applied at massive scale, it consolidates control under the guise of neutrality. Supporters of the theory argue that this level of ownership is not just financial, it is political. When a firm has influence over defense contractors, pharmaceutical giants, news organizations, and technology platforms, it begins to shape national and even international agendas. And unlike elected officials, these firms answer to no one. Examining the evidence further, critics have pointed to how both firms operate with a level of opacity that shields them from public accountability. While their ownership stakes are technically public information, the mechanisms behind their influence, particularly through proxy voting and board relationships, are far less transparent. Shareholder meetings, for example, are rarely covered in mainstream media. Yet decisions made during those sessions can affect entire industries, from environmental regulations to censorship policies. In many cases, these firms hold enough voting power to determine the outcome of key resolutions. Vanguard, despite its passive investing model, controls a substantial portion of the votes in the companies it holds. Because it mirrors broad market indices, it ends up owning large portions of nearly every major publicly traded company in the United States and beyond. And with that ownership comes votes. Critics argue that passive investment is not passive at all. When a company can quietly vote on behalf of millions of shareholders who never read the fine print, real power is centralized in very few hands. BlackRock, on the other hand, has taken a more active role in shaping global finance. Under Larry Fink's leadership, the firm has released annual letters to chief executives urging them to adopt what he calls stakeholder capitalism, a business model that considers social and environmental impacts alongside profit. While this may sound progressive, skeptics suggest that it gives BlackRock the ability to direct the behavior of companies without ever appearing on the front lines of policy. If a company fails to meet BlackRock's expectations, it may lose the firm's investment. A threat that few boards can ignore. Another point of concern lies in the relationships between these financial giants and major political institutions. BlackRock has former executives placed in central roles within the United States Treasury and the European Commission. In 2020, the European Union hired BlackRock to advise on environmental banking regulations, despite the firm's vast holdings in fossil fuel companies. This raised immediate alarms about regulatory capture, the phenomenon where industry players exert influence over the very agencies meant to regulate them. The revolving door between finance and government adds to the suspicion. When former regulators join BlackRock, and former BlackRock executives become regulators, the boundaries between public interest and private profit blur. Critics argue this is no longer capitalism. It is financial technocracy, where unelected firms write the rules and enforce them through sheer economic weight. Even more troubling is the idea that this influence is largely invisible to the public. Most people with retirement accounts, mutual funds, or pension plans have their money managed by BlackRock or Vanguard without knowing it. They unknowingly empower a system that concentrates decision-making power into the hands of two institutions. Institutions that do not answer to voters, do not run for office, and are rarely named in news cycles. And that, for many, is the most compelling argument of all. Not everyone agrees with the conspiracy. In fact, defenders of BlackRock and Vanguard often argue that the fear surrounding their influence is based on misunderstandings of how modern finance works. They point out that much of the ownership attributed to these firms is on behalf of clients, pension funds, retirement plans, and individual investors, not for the companies themselves. From this perspective, BlackRock and Vanguard are simply custodians, holding and managing wealth for others, not wielding it for secret agendas. This distinction, they argue, is critical. When a fund like Vanguard owns 10% of a corporation, it is not because Vanguard itself bought a 10% stake for its own use. Rather, it is because thousands of individuals chose to invest in a fund that tracks the market. Those individuals, not the firm, are the true owners. The firm's job is to manage the assets and ensure they grow. It does not necessarily mean it controls the companies in which the funds are invested. In the case of voting rights, defenders say that passive funds do indeed vote on behalf of investors, but the rules are changing. In recent years, both Vanguard and BlackRock have begun offering large institutional clients more control over how their shares are voted. In other words, the firms are trying to decentralize the voting process in response to criticism. These efforts are often cited as proof that the companies are listening and evolving, not plotting in the shadows. Supporters also emphasize the stability that these firms bring to global markets. In times of crisis, their sheer size allows them to absorb shocks that might otherwise destabilize entire economies. When smaller investors panic and sell, passive funds tend to hold, preventing sudden crashes. Some argue that without institutions like BlackRock and Vanguard, markets would be more volatile, not less. There is also the argument that the conspiracy theory itself misrepresents how competition works. Just because two firms hold large shares in many companies does not mean those companies are not competing. Investment firms are legally prohibited from coordinating corporate strategies across the companies they invest in. While the optics may seem suspicious, regulation exists to prevent anti-competitive behavior. Detractors say the idea of a grand collusion between Apple and Microsoft or Coca-Cola and Pepsi ignores the legal and operational walls that exist between these businesses. And finally, some argue that if these firms were truly operating in secret, we would not know about their holdings at all. The fact that their data is public and that they are heavily regulated by financial watchdogs suggests transparency, not conspiracy. In this view, the real threat is not the firms themselves, but the public's lack of financial literacy. Critics of the conspiracy theory suggest that rather than imagining hidden hands controlling the world, we should focus on increasing awareness of how money and markets truly operate. Whether one views BlackRock and Vanguard as efficient stewards of capital or as unelected powers shaping the world behind closed doors, there is no denying the far-reaching implications of their influence. At a time when trust in institutions is eroding and wealth inequality is at an all-time high, the notion that two private firms can silently steer the direction of global markets raises difficult questions. These are not fringe concerns. Economists, lawmakers, and legal scholars have all begun to explore the consequences of what some call the Big Three model, referring to BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, the third major player in passive investment. The concern is not just about concentration of ownership. It is about how that concentration alters the incentives of corporations, markets, and even governments. When the same investors own competing companies, corporate behavior changes. Research has shown that competition may decrease in industries where common ownership is high. Airlines, for example, have been cited in studies showing that prices remain elevated when investment firms hold major stakes in all the leading carriers. The same logic could apply to pharmaceuticals, media, and even housing. This theory, known as common ownership, is controversial. Critics argue that it lacks strong causal evidence, but the implications are significant. If competition, the bedrock of capitalism, is being weakened by overlapping ownership, then the very system meant to encourage innovation and consumer choice may be quietly eroding. And if that erosion benefits a small group of financial gatekeepers, it challenges everything we assume about economic freedom. There are also political implications. As BlackRock and Vanguard grow larger, they become harder to regulate. Their global footprint spans multiple jurisdictions, making it difficult for any single government to hold them accountable. In the absence of elected oversight, their internal governance systems effectively become laws unto themselves. They set environmental, social, and governance standards for the companies they own, creating an informal but powerful layer of policy influence. This kind of private regulation may align with public goals in some cases, but in others it can bypass democratic processes entirely. At the same time, media narratives about these firms remain surprisingly quiet. Despite controlling significant stakes in major media conglomerates, coverage of BlackRock and Vanguard is limited. Rarely do news segments investigate their influence. When they are mentioned, it is usually in business or financial news, not in political reporting, despite their outsized impact on both policy and public life. This silence only deepens the suspicion for those who believe in the conspiracy. After all, if the most powerful companies in the world are owned by the same investors, and those investors also control the platforms that shape public opinion, how can the public ever get the full picture? It is not just about money. It is about narrative, and when narratives are shaped by ownership, truth itself becomes a strategic asset. The cultural impact of BlackRock and Vanguard's alleged dominance extends far beyond balance sheets and boardrooms. Whether or not one believes in a centralized conspiracy, the psychological and societal consequences of such concentrated power are undeniable. In a world increasingly driven by distrust of governments, of media, of corporations, the idea that nearly all of them may be controlled by the same two financial firms has taken root in the public imagination. And that idea has begun to shape how people interpret news, politics, and even reality itself. Social media has played a significant role in amplifying these concerns. Viral infographics mapping out the overlapping ownership between BlackRock, Vanguard, and global brands have become commonplace. These posts often include logos of hundreds of companies, banks, clothing brands, tech giants, food corporations, all pointing back to the same two firms. For many, this visual representation is more powerful than any academic study. It confirms a growing belief that democracy is an illusion and that economic power has quietly replaced political power. Mainstream media rarely addresses this cultural undercurrent. When BlackRock is mentioned, it is often in the context of market performance or investor strategy. Vanguard, being structured as a client-owned firm, is even less visible. And yet, the theories surrounding them continue to grow, partly because they fill a void left by traditional journalism. In the absence of investigative reporting on concentrated financial power, conspiracy narratives have become a substitute. They offer a lens through which to make sense of economic instability, corporate corruption, and the growing gap between the powerful and the powerless. One area where this influence is especially evident is in the real estate market. Both firms have been accused of contributing to rising housing prices by purchasing large numbers of homes and rental properties across major cities. While neither company directly manages individual home purchases, they do control or invest in funds that do. The result is a housing market increasingly shaped by institutional investors rather than families or local buyers. Critics argue that this turns housing, a basic human need, into a financial instrument, one that is controlled not by communities, but by global capital. The educational sector has also felt this reach. University endowments and retirement funds are often managed by or invested in funds controlled by BlackRock and Vanguard. This extends their influence into the academic world, where research, faculty pensions, and even curriculum priorities can be subtly shaped by financial pressures. If a university depends on revenue from corporations that are owned by these firms, questions arise about whether truly independent thought is possible. In this environment, suspicion becomes a survival instinct. Many people feel alienated from the systems that govern their lives, from elections to media to employment, and theories about financial overlords offer a compelling explanation. True or not, these beliefs have become part of the cultural fabric. They affect how people vote, what they buy, and whom they trust. And in that sense, the theory of BlackRock and Vanguard's hidden hand may already be reshaping society, whether the evidence supports it or not. As the core conspiracy surrounding BlackRock and Vanguard continues to gain traction, more speculative and fringe theories have emerged. Theories that go well beyond financial influence and enter the realm of hidden agendas, global governance, and even metaphysical control. In these corners of the internet, the narrative shifts from one of economic dominance to one of engineered reality, where these firms are not just managing assets, but managing human perception, behavior, and destiny. One such theory suggests that BlackRock and Vanguard are not merely tools of capitalism, but fronts for a much older and more secretive power structure. In this view, these firms act as modern-day vessels for ancient bloodlines, secret societies, or intergenerational elites who have maintained influence through changing systems of control. According to this narrative, empires rise and fall, governments change, and ideologies shift. But the true power remains hidden behind the curtain of finance. BlackRock and Vanguard, with their opaque structures and massive influence, are seen as the latest instruments of this hidden elite. Another fringe perspective links these firms to the rise of artificial intelligence and digital surveillance. BlackRock's Aladdin platform, often praised for its predictive risk models, is reimagined as a form of financial sentience. A machine intelligence that has grown so powerful it effectively steers global markets. With $20 trillion in assets monitored by its code, Aladdin is believed by some to represent a quiet form of algorithmic governance, where decisions once made by humans are now shaped by data models beyond public scrutiny. This theory is often paired with concerns about behavioral manipulation. As both firms hold large stakes in social media platforms, advertising networks, and search engine companies, believers argue that they have access not just to wealth, but to the collective psychology of billions. By influencing what people see, read, and click, they are thought to guide behavior on a massive scale. Combined with surveillance tools and predictive algorithms, the theory suggests that these firms, or those behind them, are engaged in an invisible war for control over human thought. Some even tie these ideas into spiritual frameworks. In these versions, BlackRock and Vanguard are portrayed not just as financial actors, but as symbols of a larger metaphysical struggle between light and darkness. Their global reach, their anonymity, and their influence over essential systems, money, food, energy, media, housing, make them archetypes of control. Whether interpreted through religious prophecy, occult traditions, or New Age beliefs, they become avatars of an unseen force steering humanity toward a future chosen by the few. While mainstream commentators dismiss these views as paranoid or unfounded, their growth speaks to something deeper. A rising sense that the world is no longer governed by democratic ideals or transparent institutions, but by abstract entities no one truly understands. And in that vacuum of understanding, the imagination fills in the gaps. It draws lines between data points and forms a picture, one that may be exaggerated, but which reflects a very real hunger for truth in an age of confusion. The story of BlackRock and Vanguard challenges our understanding of power in the 21st century, not through revolution, war, or politics, but through quiet influence, data-driven control, and financial ownership. These two firms have come to shape the structure of modern life. They do not appear on ballots, yet they can steer policy. They do not broadcast their intentions, yet their holdings stretch into the most intimate aspects of society, from the food we eat to the information we consume. Some argue that this is simply the natural result of capitalism operating at scale. That in a world driven by markets and efficiency, it is inevitable that a few institutions would rise to manage trillions in assets, but others see a pattern, one that suggests power has quietly shifted away from elected leaders and toward entities few can name, let alone challenge. The world is not ruled by conspiracy, they say. It is ruled by structure. And within that structure, BlackRock and Vanguard sit at the top, invisible to most, but deeply embedded in everything. Whether these firms are benevolent stewards of global capital or part of a vast hidden agenda, one thing is clear: their influence is real. Their decisions affect governments, industries, and individuals alike. They shape what gets built, what gets funded, and what stories get told. And in a time of growing inequality, political instability, and technological change, the question becomes not just what they own, but who, if anyone, is watching them. As conspiracy theories continue to fill the silence left by conventional narratives, they serve a deeper function. They do not just offer explanations. They offer a way to navigate uncertainty, to connect seemingly random events into something coherent, even if unproven. For many, the theory about BlackRock and Vanguard is not just about facts. It is about the feeling that something massive, hidden, and unchecked is steering the course of history. Thanks for listening. This has been another episode of Conspiracy Theories and Cover-Ups. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to support the show, gain access to bonus content, and unlock our entire library of video podcasts, subscribe to the Forbidden Knowledge Network on Patreon. Subscribe now.